Fab. I'm calling you live on YouTube from Karachi. And yesterday, or I would say rather today at 5 o'clock, I did start this little readout aloud sessions with all of you. And this is a continuation of what I started this morning. I'm feeling very restless. I don't know about you guys, but I'm feeling restless because I just feel that we have technically, literally put our country and a nation of 220 million people in the lap of the economic hitmen who are there to destroy the livelihoods of our people and to destroy their lives. So, this is why I can't sleep. I'm concerned. I'm worried. I did a live protest at the Karachi Press Club today. I did it in front of the masses. I did it to express my concerns, to condemn the fiscal policy of the current government. And this is my attempt to show the world and to show the policymakers that my concerns are not arising out of my paranoia or my own judgment or my own prejudice or bias, but they're arising out of some very important objective data that has proven itself again and again and again in the history of these organizations. So it is important for you to bear with me as I read today to you this Cavanagh-Mander report that was written in Washington by the Institute of Policy Studies. So bear with me. The topic is it says a critique of corporate globalization, and the topic is World Bank IMF turned poor third world nations into loan addicts. As you know, yesterday or this morning actually, I at 5 o'clock I did read to you about what it says about the IMF. Today I'm going to tell you about what it says about the rest of the organizations. Creating a world that works for all must begin with an effort to undo the enormous damage inflicted by the free trade economic policies that so badly distort economic relationships among people and countries. The thrust of those policies is perhaps most dramatically revealed in the structural adjustment programs imposed on low and intermediate income countries by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Structural adjustment requires governments to do the following. Number one, cut government spending on education, healthcare, the environment, and price subsidies for basic necessities such as food, grains, and cooking oils. Number two, devalue the national currency and increase exports by accelerating the plunder of national resources, reducing real wages, and subsidizing export-oriented foreign investments. Number three, liberalize or open financial markets to attract speculative short-term portfolio investments that create enormous financial instability and foreign liabilities while serving little, if any, useful purpose. Next number, eliminate tariffs and other controls on imports, thereby increasing the import of consumer goods purchased with borrowed foreign exchange, undermining local industry and agricultural producers unable to compete with cheap imports, increasing the strain on foreign exchange accounts and deepening external indebtedness. Now, this last point was done by the previous government, by the government of Nawaz Sharif. The rest of the points have been done by the current government under the IMF regulations. So, starting with the World Bank. According to its charter, the World Bank was created to assist in the reconstruction and development of territories of member nations by facilitating the investment of capital for productive purposes and to promote the long-range balanced growth of international trade. The World Bank was originally intended to focus on financing the post-World War II reconstruction of Europe using capital subscribed by member governments against which it could borrow in international financial markets at favorable rates and then lend out for development projects. When Europe showed little interest in mortgaging the future of its economy to foreign bankers, the World Bank set about marketing its loans in the newly independent former colonies. At first, that too proved a hard sell. So the bank invested in training and education to indoctrinate scores of third world bureaucrats and economists in an economic ideology that equates development with export led economic growth fueled by foreign borrowing and investment, the basic fallacy that remains a cornerstone of its policy today. Does all of this ring a bell to you guys? This is the history, this is the economic, fiscal history of Pakistan. This is where we faltered. This is where we made all our mistakes and blunders. This is why we are where we are today. This is why we have a record inflation, a record debt crisis. This is why we are in such a big mess today. Originally, so continuing with this, originally the loans were used to finance infrastructure projects and imports beyond the means of the country's export earnings. Eventually, ever larger new loans were needed just to service payment of interest and principal due on previous loans. The more the borrowing, the greater the need for still larger loans. And borrowing became something of an economic addiction. Aside from a handful of citizen watchdog groups, few paid attention to the burden these loans placed on domestic economies when the time came to repay. During the 1970s, OPEC sharply increased oil prices and hence the cost of energy imports. Northern banks, awash with OPEC deposits, lavished loans on third world countries, often with the encouragement of the World Bank. Soon the cost of debt service exceeded repayment capacity by such a wide margin that there was a threat of a global financial crisis. Beginning with Mexico in 1982, the World Bank and the IMF swung into action with structural adjustments as their primary response. Together, they reoriented national economies to focus on debt repayment and to further open their resources, labor, and markets to foreign corporations. Adjusted countries came under great pressure to increase the export of their natural resources, and the products of their labor became more import dependent and increased the foreign ownership of their economies. So basically, increase the foreign ownership of their economies. Once the countries accepted these conditions, the IMF and the World Bank rewarded them with still more loans, thus deepening their indebtedness, rather like a fireman pouring gasoline on a burning house to stop the blaze. So this is what they're trying to say, that you see a house that's on fire, and instead of putting water on it, you're putting more and more fire on it to try to extinguish the flames. This is what I'm talking about over here. The results have been disastrous, not only in human and environmental terms, but also in economic terms. In 1980, the total external debt of all developing countries was $609 billion. In 2001, after 20 years, in only 20 years of structural adjustment, it totaled to $2.4 trillion. Do you see this? It has been the scam of the last century. In 2001, Sub-Saharan Africa paid $3.6 billion more in debt service than it received in new long-term loans and credits. Africa spends about 4 times more on debt service payments than it does on healthcare. This is how crazy this is. In recent years, the World Bank has provided hundreds of billions of dollars in low interest loans to subsidize the efforts of global corporations to establish control over the natural resources and markets of assisted countries. Corporations in the energy and agriculture sectors have been among the main beneficiaries. Often, World Bank financed roads, power plants, and electrical grids were built primarily to serve the global corporations establishing operations in the service area of the loan financed facilities rather than to serve the local populations. Indeed, as documented by the Institute for Policy Studies, the World Bank has become the major contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions through fossil fuel projects that primarily benefit global corporations. Regional development banks, such as the Asian Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, have generally copied the World Bank's model. The next is the IMF that I spoke about. You should probably, I'm going to tag that one as the first one that I spoke about. Is this whole discussion, and I read the whole thing for you guys this morning. The third one that they have spoken about is the World Trade Organization. So the GATT and the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, has emerged as the third pillar of the Bretton Woods system. A very healthy debate was launched after World War II about the need for a global trade and investment institution that could help generate full employment, protect worker rights around the world, and protect against what were then referred to as global cartels, small groups of corporations that gained too much power over a sector. These broad-based goals were enshrined in a charter that proposed the formation of an international trade organization. Rejected by the US Senate. Again, I repeat, rejected by the US Senate on the grounds that its broad mandate would compromise US sovereignty. I repeat, keep your eyes and ears open. I repeat, this is to all the policymakers and breakers of Pakistan. Rejected by the US Senate on the grounds that its broad mandate would compromise US sovereignty, only one element of the ITO, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was created instead, with the more narrow goal of reducing tariffs on goods and services and setting up a handful of broad trade principles. World trade grew dramatically following World War II under the guidance of the GATT. While initially limited to this trade expansion mandate, the GATT evolved into an institution that promoted corporate rights over human rights and other social and environmental priorities. In the early 1980s, economists and politicians powered by the so-called Reagan Revolution in the US and the Thatcher and Kohl ascendancies in Europe began planning a new but substantially different GATT negotiating around. The goal was to expand the GATT disciples to bind signatory governments to a set of multilateral policies regarding the service, government procurement, and investment sectors, to establish global limits on government regulation of environmental, food safety, and product standards, to establish new protections for corporate intellectual property rights granted in rich countries, and to have this broad panoply of one-size-fits-all rules strongly enforced over every level of government in every signatory country. This is